Right. All right, Chevre, here we go. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Lamed Tes. We started already yesterday on top of the Amid, in the beginning of the Daf, the Mishnah teaching us about the mitzvah of Morer. We're going to continue to learn more about the 4 or 5 types mentioned in the Mishnah. As we mentioned, it's 4 or 5 because the 5th one that the Mishnah mentions, Ube Morer, there we have a machloikes tanoim, we have a machloikes, Rishonim, whether Morer is a name of a specific type or Morer is the Mishnah concluding that any type of vegetable or herb that has a bitterness to it could be used for Morer. And indeed, we're going to continue to learn in the Braisa various other types of vegetables, and the Gemara will conclude that any vegetable that has the following 2 characteristics, which is that it is pale green and it has a bitter sap, is taka valid for Morer. Nevertheless, as we explained when we learned the Mishnah, that the Seder of the Mishnah is Meduyak, and the ones that are mentioned in the Mishnah first should be the ones that one should, in the outset, lechatchila, look for to fulfill the mitzvah of Morer. We're going to learn also some dinim of Kalayim, some of which we just learned not that long ago in Shabbos Daf Pei Daled. We're going to also question whether Morer, that is Ma'aser Sheni, whether obviously it's a midrabanan because vegetables only need to be tied midrabanan, but whether we link that to the machlokes we had on Daf Lamed Vav between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. We're going to, God willing, begin the new Mishnah on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis that is going to teach us about various actions that may or may not bring about the chimutz process, and we're going to learn 2 basic dinim. Number 1, whether it is flour or even grain, if they are properly baked in an oven, after that, they can never become chametzik. Number 2, if you are to scald flour or grain with boiling hot water, now the scalding process is something that you need to know exactly what you're doing. After that process, also, the grains or the flours can never become chametzik again. Actually, when it comes to scalding, there is a tremendous fear that if you don't do it properly, and there's a moment where the water that touches the flour is not boiling hot, not only will it stop the chimutz process, but pum fakert, as we learned already, that mayim poishrim, lukewarm waters, and for sure hot waters, if they're not boiling, not only do they not stop the chimutz process, but they hasten substantially the chimutz process, and right away that can become chametzik, which is, as we'll conclude in today's shiur, the Rosh and the Rif and many other poskim, based on them, say that since we don't know how to do the scalding process, one should never do that when it comes to Pesach. However, we do accept in halacha that, again, that if grains or flour was properly baked in the oven, then it can no longer become chametz. Now, this really explains why the whole inyan of us not eating gebrachs is a chumrah, as the Alter Rebbe writes. Because me'ikar adin, once a matzah was in the oven, what are you afraid of? That maybe there's some flour in there that was never in contact with water before? Al pi halacha, even if that were to happen, it doesn't bother me if later the flour has contact with water. It will never become chametzik because it was baked, as we're going to learn today in Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis. Nevertheless, there's a chumrah. Maybe it wasn't properly baked. V'chulei, v'chulei. And let's start where we left off. We left off on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph. We are in the second wide line. So again, the Mishnah enumerated 4 or 5 types of Morer and various other dinim as well, as we'll get back to today. And tomorrow, God willing, in Daf Mem, we're as we're gonna get to today, because the Daf Mem is already based on a new Mishnah. The Braisa brought other names of vegetables, some of which will translate in English, and some of them will just leave them in their original language. And we are continuing Tanei Devei Shmuel, or Tanei Devei Reb Shmuel. Right? If this is the Shmuel, Levi and Shmuel, Rav and Shmuel, then we call them without a title, Gadol. Right, Mirabon Shemoy, as is the rule, people are titled People that don't need to be titled, that's because their name is the greatest title. So in his yeshiva, they taught the following brayso that Elu Yirakesh Adam Yoitze Behen Yidei Chavasim BePesach. And here, like we have in the Mishnah, the Seder, the first one he mentions is chazeres. Chazeres, as we said, is chasa. Chasa is lettuce, or maybe it's romaine lettuce, or some other type of lettuce. And the number 2 is be'ulshin, let's taich, according to those who say ulshin is endives. Ubetamcha, according to some, tamcha means what we call chrein, horseradish, even though many disagree with that, just to repeat that, because they hold that every item that's mentioned in the Mishnah is a green leaf, and that excludes horseradish. Now, they're not saying that horseradish may not be used, but they are saying that it's not the first thing you should look after. It's not number 3, or as we have in our Mishnah, chrein is not number 2. Okay. Ubecharvinim, ubecharginim. Some people say charginim is oregano. Shtal zechvar. Ubehardoifnin. Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, af chazeres yulin. You know, chazeres yulin is some sort of subcategory in lettuce, and the chazeres galin are kayoytze behem, are as good as chazeres itself. Says weiter the Braisa, Rabbi Eloi says, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, af ar kablin. Now many touch that ar kablin is what we learned above in the Braisa, that is char chavinim, or char charvina, which is some sort of vine that wraps itself and goes up a palm tree. Imagine that vine itself has a bitterness to it, and that can be used for mother. Now, Rabbi Eloi remembers hearing it from Rabbi Eliezer. However, says Rabbi Eloi that v'chazarti al kol talmidav, I asked the other talmidei of Rabbi Eliezer, do you remember hearing this from him? Uvikashti li chaver and v'loi motzasi. No one remembered hearing that from Rabbi Eliezer. However, this is all Rabbi Eloi is speaking. When I came lifnei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, so he was the one that that Rabbi Eliezer ruled that this ar kablin is oichet good for maroir. Says the Braisa weiter, Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, this is the klal. After we enumerated all these specific types of vegetables, that kol sheyesh lo saraf or siraf, anything that has sap in it, and the saps and leaves have a certain bitterness, like we mentioned also yesterday. We're not looking for that which is the most sharp. That chrein for sure is very sharp. We're looking for that which is bitter. Don't confuse sharpness and bitterness. Kol shepanav machsifin. Anything whose appearance, any vegetable whose appearance is pale, and when he means pale, it means pale green. It's interesting. The darker the green, the less the bitter. Kol yerek mar, any bitter vegetable, yesh loy sarav, by default is something that will have sap and upon of machsifin and will have a pale greenish appearance. Amar Rab Yechanan, that midivrei kulam nilmad, that yerek mar, that a vegetable that's bitter will have sarav upon of machsifin, and what he really means to say is that any vegetable that has these 2 characteristics are valid to use for maroir. Amar Afuna, halach indeed is ka'acherim. Ravina ashkechel Rav Achabrei Ravo, that he was the Hava Mahadir dafka on a vegetable called amirirsa, right? He was not looking for the chazeres, as we mentioned, according to most, that the Seder in the Mishnah and in the Braisas Meduya, the first one mentioned, is ideally the first one to be used. In other words, and he was doing something different. He was looking for that vegetable called mirirsa and Omar Lei. So Ravina asked him, "My daitech, why are you dafka looking for this mirirsa vegetable?" Because I know why. Because the mirir and tvei, because they're very bitter. You think the more bitter, forget about sharp. The more bitter, the better. No, snishtamis. You don't even have to look for that which is the most bitter. V'haraya, says Ravina, v'hachazeres tanan. Chazeres, meaning that it's the first one mentioned in the Mishnah. And likewise, V'tana devei Shmuel, as we started today, the Braisa taught in the Yeshiva of Shmuel, the first one mentioned is also Chazeres. And V'amar Rabbi Oishaya, that mitzvah, dafka, in other words, the ideal is Chazeres. And Chazeres, we know, is not the most bitter. Furthermore, V'amar Rava, my Chazeres, and as we learned above in the beginning of the Gemara, Chazeres is Chasa. And my chasa, why is it called chasa? Why is lettuce called chasa? Because the chas rachmana ilavan, because God had rachmanas on us. In other words, the name given to lettuce is because this is the ideal one we use for mother. And all of that brings about a certain amount of rachamim. And furthermore, and again, mother is ideally chazeres. Loimer loch, that just like mother is chazeres, lettuce, is not that bitter in the beginning. Not only that, in the beginning, when you leave it in the ground a little bit, it's very soft. And only afterwards, if you leave it there for a longer amount of time, so its stalks become very hard. Rashi says hard like wood. So af mitzrayim, that chilas and raka, like Rashi says in the beginning, raka means that they would pay us for our labor. You get paid, so you can be working very hard, but it doesn't feel that difficult because you're getting reward. And it was only later that kasha that they somehow tricked us, and we fell into that, and we started to work, so to say, like slaves. And under the verter that there are many reasons why lettuce, it's not the most bitter. I sigh because of its name, chasa rachmanis, sigh because it's dafka, that type of vegetable that chilas and rach and the soifer kasha. This is the ideal item used for mother, and indeed, amalei hadrabi I retract my shita. I'm not going to look first for merirsa. Now, no one is saying that merirsa is b'diavad not good. We said that if you can't find the ones mentioned, then get anything that's bitter. But it's not the ideal mother. Says the Gemara, B'chlal, when you're reading the Torah, how do you know that mother is a min yarak? Maybe ema mirirsa the kufya. I know mother means bitter. So he's saying that the fish, the gallbladder of a fish, is very bitter. Maybe that is what Hashem wants us to eat. So the Gemara says that can't be. Because dumi the matzah. And as we just quoted the pasuk in Baha Alois, I know the pasuk is about Ma'atzah Sheni, but we just had it right yesterday, 2 days ago. We had on Daf Lamed Zayin, right? Al matzah sumaroidim yoichlu. So al matzah sumaroidim, we had 3 daf ago. So we juxtapose matzah and mother. And what does the Hekesh teach us? Ma matzah gedulei karka, af mother should be gedulei karka, which excludes afishale. Ai ve'ema hirduf. Zokt Rashi, was does hirduf? It's some sort of plant. Rashi says some sort of a wood, some sort of tree. It's the tree that Moshe Rabbeinu used, as written in Bishalach. That was the wood that he put into the waters that were bitter. And that was the nes b'toich nes, Rashi reminds us. That the wood that was bitter, that in itself sweetened the waters. But how do you know it's the vegetable? Maybe it's a min eitz. Again, answers the Gemara. Dumi the matzah. Ma matzah min zeroyim. Even though some people say that the eitz hadas, toivara, was a chita. Maybe part of the punishment is that it changed from being a min eitz and it became a min zeroyim. But anyways, here we're calling all of the 5 grains from which we have to take matzah from. The Mishnah Daf Lamed Hey, min zeroyim. Af mored is min zeroyim and not a tree. Okay, so weiter says the Gemara, ve'ema harzifu. Harzifu, Rashi says, is a type of plant that's poisonous to animals. It's not going to kill a person, but maybe that's the pshat of murder, that it's like how it damages the person. Mar says, no, dumi the matzah again, nachamol. What's now the hekesh from matzah? Ma matzah hanik sheni kachas because of meiser. Matzah is something that could be bought with kesev meiser. Now we're not opining over here whether meiser sheni could be used. I know Rabbi Yosef Lili says it may not be used, but matzah is a type that you could use mo'ois meiser sheni to purchase it in Yerushalayim. What may not be purchased with mo'ois meiser sheni? Anything, Rashi says, that's not called food. Something that's poisonous, even only for animals, is not called a meichel. And you can't use meiser sheni money to purchase it with. So af marer, only that item, shenikach bekesev meiser. So now there's nothing left other than what we understand marer, which is bitter vegetables. Not b'chlal, when it comes to all of these chazals, we have a Masoida, we know what to eat. We're not asking, b'poyel mamish, that we should change what we're eating. We're eating the type of mother that our parents ate, that their parents ate. We're trying to find out whether this is something that you can at least see beremes in the Torah, that indeed mother is a vegetable and not all of the above. Okay. The Torah uses the word, why don't we say that only one type of vegetable is okay? Because mother is one type. Chad. And the Mishnah gave 4 or 5 types. Then we have in the Braisa many other types. And then we have B'chlal, it can be beyond that. If it's green and there's sraf and it's a pale green, maybe it's only one type is kosher. So the Gemara says that for sure not as a question, because the Torah says al matzos u'meroirim, meroirim ksid, which is lashon rabim, but still counters the Gemara. Maybe it means only 2 types of vegetables are good, meroirim today. So again, do me the matzah. Nachahekesh ma matzah minim harbe, af marar minim harbe. Now it's interesting that we do not say that matzah is only chamesh minim. We know the Gemara doesn't even ask that. And now we're coming out that even though Taka the Mishnah counts 5, if the Mishnah means with marar a specific type, but we can add many more, but that's already enough. Minim harbe, afkan minim harbe. Amar Rabba barafuna amar Rav. Here we go, Chedra. Rav made a statement. His statement is Yerakois she'amru chachamim she'adam yoytze behem yedei chavasa b'Pesach. All types of vegetables that are good for marar, kulam nizroyim ba'aruga achas. They all may be planted in one bed. Wow. Now, we know that we're not allowed to plant 2 different seeds in a way that they take nourishment from each other. And there's also a big maras ayin issue, as we just learned in Shabbos, Daf Pei Daled, midoiraisa connected to kalayim. And Rav seems to be saying that anything that's in the category of marar is considered one species. And we'll see in a moment, Zicher did not say that. No, they're not the same species. Lamemra says the Gemara that Rav is saying the leis b'hum mishum kalayim, which would only work if they are considered halachically one species. That can be Masiv Rava, a Mishnah in kalayim. The Mishnah says that chazeres, mamash, we're speaking about the types that we use for marar. Now you have chazeres, which is lettuce, and then you have the subspecies of chazeres called chazeres galen, or ulshin, let's touch its endives. The ulshin sada, wild endives. Kirishin leeks. The kirishe sada, wild leeks. Kuzbar is coriander. The kuzbar sada. Chardel, the chardel mitzri. Mustard, and then the specific type of mustard known as Egyptian mustard. The las hamitzri, Egyptian gourd, and remutza, stam gourd. So the Mishnah says, and it's mashma that we're speaking only about these pairs, they are einam kalayim zebozeh. Even though that this is a subcategory, but the fact that it has the same name, plus a Shem Levi, it's still considered same enough that you may plant them mamish together. In other words, it's the Gemara Medayik, the Mishnah is saying chazeres v'chazeres galen in. That is one species. But chazeres and ulshin are not the same species. Now we know that we can use for marar both chazeres and ulshin. So if Rav is saying that all of the marar types are considered one species, it's going against the Mishnah. And if you're going to tell me that that's not what the Mishnah means, the Mishnah doesn't only permit chazeres and chazeres galen. Not only ulshin and ulshin, whatever, me'esade, the chitema kula bahadadi katani lahu, that the Mishnah and Kalayim taka means that all of these items can be planted one with the other. We know it can't mean. You know how we know it? This is beautiful. From Rav himself. When Rav taught Mishnah and Kalayim, v'ha'amar Rav, the last line of the Amid, that zugay is katani. Wow. So he was the one that made it clear the Mishnah and Kalayim doesn't allow one type with the other. So therefore, clarifies the Gemara that when we quoted the Rabba Barafuna Amarav regarding the Yerakos of marar, that Kulam Nizroim Baruga Achas, what does Rav mean? My Nizroim da Amarav, Nizroim Kihil Hassan. Guys, look inside the last Rashi without repeating all of the details. And for those who don't remember, go back to Shabbos Daf Pei Daled. But there we spoke about the whole idea of Maras Ayin, Mido Oiraisa, being a factor in Kalayim. And we were speaking about when you have a patch, when vegetables are planted in patches. So we learned over there, the pratim, that if you have a patch that's only 6 tfachim by 6 tfachim, you are able to plant in that 5 different types of seeds by planting on all of the extremities, on the perimeter, right on the perimeter, you plant a row, that's 4, and then you plant one in the middle, and we make the whole cheshbon, how that will give you the minimum space needed of separation between one and the other. In other words, when we learn Dinei Kalayim, there's something about a aruga that's 6 by 6 tfachim, in which you are able to plant 5 different seeds. So what Rav is saying is that enachanami, that aside of chazeres and chazeres galen, aside of ulshin and ulshay sadeh, the marar is not considered the same species. What Rav meant to say is, and we'll see what the chiddush is that normally Kalayim is referring to seeds. Here we're speaking about vegetables. We're going to see this in a moment on Amud Beis. You might have thought that a larger space is needed for vegetables. So Rav says no, that the halacha that we learn in Kalayim, and that is, look inside the last Rashi, the end of the Rashi, that chamisha zar'oinim, that you can plant 5 different types of seeds. If you have a patch of land that's 6 by 6 tfachim, as we have in Shabbos Daf Pei Daled, that we are allowed to apply that minimum shiur even to marar. And there has to be a chiddush with that. Okay, but the Gemara says, Kil Hassan, well, hold on. If that's what he's saying, not that you can plant them together, but you have to use that minimum amount of separation. Well, that is also a Tanina. That's also one of the Mishnah, Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, another Mishnah in Kalayim. What does it say over there? That Aruga, Shehi, Shisha, Al Shisha Tfachim, that any patch of land, that a bed, it's called, that is 6 by 6 Tfachim, Zoidin Betoicha, Chamisha Zir'oinim. And how do you plant it? How do you plant the 5? It has to be dafka separated. That 4 should be al arba ruchais. And if you remember over there on Shabbos that you can't go mamash from one end to the other because then they'll be touching each other. But since they're in different directions, right? When you're making a box, so it's perpendicular, so it's visible to the eye that it's not together. So there, a minimum amount of separation is enough, and then 1 point in the center, which gives you the minimum amount of space which is needed when you plant individual things. We're going to learn, we learned also when you plant a kerem, then you have to have a larger distance versus when you have one vine. But anyways, coming back over here, we're not speaking about kilei hakerem, we're speaking about bachlal planting kilei zeroyim, and the Mishnah says the rule already. So why do I need to have Rav to tell me that the same rule applies to marar if you have to still subscribe to the minimum amount of separation? So the Gemara says, no, there is a chiddush that Rav has to come and teach us. Because Matilde Tema, had we only had the Mishnah in Kalayim, we would have thought Hanamina Bezroyim, which is exactly what the Mishnah in Kalayim specifies explicitly, seeds. Avol biyarakos. But when it comes to vegetables, and marar is in the category of vegetables, because seeds are consumed. Zuraim is a seed that you can like chitim, a grain. If you eat it, you're consuming the seeds. Vegetables is categorized as that which is plucked from the ground right before seeds develop in it. Vegetables. You might have thought that you need to have more separation. So Kamash Malan, that the same halacha that is needed, the minimum amount which is good for Zuraim, is good for Yerakos. In other words, says the Gemara, what would be your havamina? What would we have thought without Rav? Lememra, that the Yeraka is alima. Alima means is it more vigorous? More vigorous means that it needs more nourishment. You would have such a havamina, and that's why you might have thought, since they do draw more nourishment, you have to give more land for every type. So maybe you would have to have a bed that's bigger than 6 by 6. You would never think that way, because that's another Mishnah in Kilayim. V'hatanan fragt the Gemara, kol mina zerayim, ein zoyrim ba'aruga achas. Here, this Mishnah, my friend, is speaking about a patch of a land, a aruga, a bed that's less than 6 by 6. So he says that when to put 5, you have to have 6 by 6. If you don't have 6 by 6, the Mishnah says, Kol mina zeraim eino zoyrim ba'aruga achas. However, Abel Kol mina yerakos zoyrim ba'aruga achas. But vegetables could be planted in even a smaller patch of land. Again, they have to be separated. Now, we don't know exactly what is the minimum size for that. That's not Negeya. But you see from the Mishnayos in Kalayim that the opposite, that vegetables draw less nourishment. So if all that I've meant to say is Kil Hassan, of course. So the Gemara says, no, Hanamila, Matilde Tema, without Rabbi would have thought that Hani Marid min Zeroyim Nil. Fakert, we might have categorized Marid as a min Zeroyim. And the smaller bed that the second Mishnah that we learned on Amud Beis, right, Mishnah Beis, Kalayim Mishnah Beis, that Mishnah will not apply to Marid. So Rav is saying no, that it is considered, it's considered the vegetable. The Gemara says, why would anyone think that Marid is Zeroyim? Why would we think that? The Gemara Zeroyim, Salka Daitach? No such a Havamina. Look at the Lashon of our Mishnah, Daf Lamed Tes. The Mishnah begins, by using the words yirakos, right? Ve'elu yirakos she'adam yoytze behem yedei chavasa b'Pesach, b'chazeres u'betamcha, etc. That's the lashon in the Mishnah. When we began in the Gemara, we learned that yesterday. The brayso that was stood in the yeshiva of Bar Kapara, the brayso begins with the words yirakos. When we started to learn today, the Tanach Devei Shmuel vayte yirakos. So the Gemara says you're right. However, there is one thing we need a draw for, and that is the chazeres. It's not any one of the 5 species, but actually, as we learned today, it's the first one we should look for. Chazeretz itzralei salkadai techamina. Also, as we learned, alpi pnimius, right, that chazeres has the advantage that's tchilos irach, but v'soifa kasha, that since chazeres v'soifa lahakshis, if you leave it in the ground, its stalks becomes very hard, and like Rashi adds, and they become thicker. Which means if you would leave them in the ground, they would occupy more space. Taka, here you would think that even in a patch of 6 by 6 tfachim, it's not good to plant maror, specifically chazeres. So therefore, nesav lo raf chatvei, you would need more space, whatever more that would mean. So Raf says no. And Lav Amar Rabbi Yossi, like, did not Rabbi Yossi but Rabbi Chanina say that kelach shall kruv, that a stalk of cabbage is not good for mother. But when we're speaking about a stalk of cabbage, that when it becomes hard, there we have actually a shiur. You know how much more space you need to have to plant near this kalach shel kruv. Any other plant, the amount of land needed to plant a quarter of a kav of produce, which is, my friends, 10.2 times 10.2 amas. Forget about 6 tfachim by 6 tfachim. You know, as we find that by certain other vegetables, when they become hard, you need a huge amount of space between one type and another, because indeed this kruv is taka drawing nourishment from a huge amount of space. So almost, so if we see from Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Chanina that keeping the sefer lahakshos, that's something that eventually will become hard. So we might have thought without Rav. So that is what we learned. Oh, that's all that Rav is saying. Rav is not saying that they're the same species. Rav is not saying that you can plant them together. All Rav is saying is that Komash Malon, that as long as Chazeres is not yet hard, he's not saying that when it's hard, it doesn't need extra space. It does need. But people normally don't leave it in the ground. What's the point? It becomes hard like wood. Loses its tam, and you can't eat it. No, since chazeres normally is plucked from the ground before it becomes that hard, and when it's still soft, it has a din like yirakos, which is actually draws nourishment from a lesser amount of land than zeroim, so you can apply to it the halacha of yirakos. That is what Rav is saying. Now, again, it's not clear from what we learned today, what is the lesser amount of land that is good enough to plant, let's say, 5 types of yirakos, but it's a lesser amount than zeroim. Okay. Kamash Malan, again, that you don't need extra space. Now we are referring back to the Mishnah. To quickly chazer the Mishnah. After the Mishnah enumerated the 5, then the Mishnah said, Yoitzin bohen bein lachen ben yaveshim, which is a chiddush. And what we are looking for is the taste of bitterness. The harder, the drier something gets, normally, the more of its bitterness that it loses. The Mishnah is saying that even if it's yavesh, you're good. And then the Mishnah said another couple of dinim, and then it says v'yoytzim v'kalach shalahem. That b'chlal, when we speak about these vegetables, you don't have to have dafkid their leaves; even their stalks are also good. And I think we quoted the Tosfos, but not the roots. Okay, beseder. So it says the Gemara Gavaldik Lechidush on how to learn the pshat in the Mishnah. That when it says yoytzim bohen bein lachem ben yeveshim, so Rab Chizda says those words of the Mishnah only refer to a kelach. It only refers to the stalks of these yirakos of mother. Aval be'olin, but when it comes to the leaves, lachin, yeah, because lachem has in it a tam of bitterness. But if they become yeveshim, then loi. Why? Because the ikir by mother is not the food, but it is the tam of merirus, which is how we explain those who learn that when the Mishnah says kavushim, it does not exclude what kavushim means in Yoredeya, which in Yeredeya, kavush means soaking even in water for 24 hours. Many poskim say that if the vegetables of the mother soaked in water for 24 hours, it is still okay because it's still bitter. All we care about is the time of meridos. Well, leaves that are dry don't taste bitter. Problem is, it doesn't exactly fit in the Mishnah. Because as we just quoted the Mishnah, what's first the Mishnah says, then the Mishnah says a few lines later that you can be yoitze even bekelach shalohen. Now, from the Hemshech HaMishnah, Mechlal, that when the Mishnah said the words yoitzen bohen, ben lachem, ben yeveshim, before the Mishnah even mentioned kelach, is that not mashma that the reish of the Mishnah, this liner, ben lachem, ben yeveshim, is either only speaking about the alin, or at least also speaking about the alin, because the Mishnah is megala, it's also kelach, but it's zicher speaking about the leaves, it doesn't flow, asks the Gemara against the Rab Chizda. Answers the Gemara, no, that you can learn pshat in the Mishnah, that perusha komafarish, that ki ketani ben lachem, ben yeveshim, says the Mishnah 2 lines later, that's only a kelach. And if you're having the alin, then it has to be moist. Okay, okay, now that we didn't refute Rab Chizda from the Mishnah, let's go. It says in a Braisa, really, you have a machlokes here, Rav Meir and the Chachamim. And as we'll see in a moment, our Mishnah for sure is Rav Meir. And we'll see clearly in the Braisa that what Rav Meir says is not aligned at all with Rab Chizda. What Rab Chizda is contradicting Rav Meir. It says in the Braisa, Yoitzin bohen ubekelach shalohem. Bohen must mean the leaves. Right, with them and even with their stalks, bein lachim, bein yeveshim. Chayra, you read the Mishnah, you read the Braisa, divrei Rav Meir. Rav Meir is saying that whether it is bohen, whether it is bekalach, whether it is lachin, whether it is yeveshim, it's all good. The Chachamim say lachim yoitzin bohen, yeveshim ein yoitzin bohen. You're not the yoitze yavish. Now our Mishnah for sure cannot be the Chachamim because our Mishnah does say bein lachim, bein yeveshim. You get it. So since our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, Rav Meir seems to be saying that Yeveshim and Lachem Yeveshim is Saiba Hen or Saiba Kelach. That's the kasha against Rav Chizda. But let's finish. For Shavin, but both the Chachamim and Rav Meir agree that you are Yoitze by Kemushim. Kamush is like Nishtahen. Kamush means it's not moist, but it's not yet considered dry. If it's Kamush, then everyone says it's okay. And here, the Braisa continues to teach what we learned in the Mishnah, but like kevushim, they cannot be preserved. Let's go with Rashi. Rashi says they can't be preserved in vinegar. But like shalukim, it cannot be overboiled, super boiled. It cannot even be stamba boiled, stam cooked. Right, the first white line, all of that takes away the tamirus. Klali shel davar, kol davar sheyesh b'ei tamar yotzim b'im. It's not enough that it comes from the species of mother. It has to have the taste of bitterness. Bottom line is, as we just explained, that our Mishnah is not Chachamim, because our Mishnah says Bein Lachem Bein Yeveshim. So it's Rav Meir. Rav Meir seems to be saying that Bein Lachem Bein Yeveshim goes both on Bohen and on the Kelach, not like Rab Chizda. So says the Gemara that Rab Chizda, who learned the Braisa, is Targuma will fartaich that when the Braisa says Bein Lachem Ben Yeveshim, Divrei Rav Meir, that only goes on the word before it, on the Kelach. Okay, it's a doichik, but you can learn that pshat in the Braisa also. But the Bein Lachem Ben Yeveshim does not go on the Bohen. Okay, so Rab Chizda stands. Right, Tana Rabbanon. Even though we learned in this Braisa that even the Chachamim, right, that hold that Yeveshim is not good, if this is, if the vegetables are dry, you're not yoitze. Nevertheless, the Braisa says that everyone agrees that you're yoitzim kemushim. Kemushim means it's not completely dry. It's called in English withered, but it's not dry. But you should know that's also a machlokes tanoim. Tana Rabbanon ein yoitzin behen kemushim. It has to mamish be moist. Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Tzadok Amru, yoitzin behen kemushim. I wonder how this affects, and I'm sure it affects somehow, that if tamcha means chrein. Now, I know that if you don't grind up the chrein, so whatever you call moist, it's not that chrein, right? The shtickle chrein is azoy lachin, but it's not the heart. But I think when you chop it up, then it can lose. So there, it's moist, and then it can become yavish. I think maybe this is the reason why some people, when they have chrein, they don't chop it up. They don't chop it up to make sure that it doesn't dry out. There are others that say that you're not allowed to have chrein that's not ground up because people won't eat a kazayas of it because it's too hard. Minik Chabad is we have both. We have chrein that's both ground up and it's in shtikalach.
Does the chrein look light green, and does it have the sap that we talked about before? I don't see that.
That many Rishonim, this is the big discussion. They say that the second item in our Mishnah means chrein, and it doesn't fit into the general rule. That's the only exception. It was the only item of mutter that the Mishnah mentions that's not green. All what we added today is that any vegetable that has sap and that is pale green is good. Because it's lettuce-like. It's like chazeres. Okay, weiter. Now, when it came to the matzah, we had a whole topic. Meiser Sheni. Right, the Mishnah says that grains that are challah, grains that are truma are okay, l'kula alma, because even though it can only be eaten by a kohen, but if a kohen makes matzah, or you make it for a kohen, it's gesund to hate. But Meiser Sheni, we had the whole machlekes Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Akiva. The question was, first of all, you need to have b'chol moish v'seichem, but for that we had an answer. Hoyel, if it becomes tamei, you can redeem it, so you could eat it anywhere, so then it's good. But the question was whether lechem oini, whether the ayin and the aleph are interchangeable to make a drasha, and meiser sheni may not be eaten by aninus. So that was a machlokes tanoim. So now the Gemara says, "Boy, Rami bar Chama, ma'u sheyetzi adam yidei chayvasi b'maroid." That is meiser sheni in Yerushalayim. And as we clarified the boya, aliba the Rabbi Akiva loiti boylach, because hashta by matzah, whose obligation nowadays is the oiraisa, nowadays meaning even when we don't yet have the Koren Pesach, and Rabbi Akiva nevertheless holds that even that limitation doesn't stop you from being able to fulfill your obligation. So for sure, nothing b'mara, which is only the Rabbanan mi boya, no one will ask such a question. Kiti boyalach, the boy of Rami bar Chama was libid Rabbi Yossi, and his question is really do we say b'matzah since it's the oiraisa, so therefore it's more chamur? That is only where Rabbi Yossi says the linafik. Avol morer, even though you can't eat it while you are in a state of aninus. But if a person is not in a state of aninus, and the whole chiyuv morer is only midrabanan, so maybe nafik, we can lower the standards. Oidilma, no, called the takinu rabbanan ke'ein doiraisa takum. But that's a very important klal. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi will hold you can't fulfill your obligation with Marar Meiser Sheni, and indeed Amarava, that mistabra, as we learned on Amad Aleph, like the hekish from the words Al Matlis Umaroidim Yechlu from Pashas Baha Aloischa, another limit from the hekish, Matzu Marar, that we're not going to allow for them to have different rules. They go on the same track. According to Rabbi Yossi, you can't be Yoitza with Marar that is of Meiser Sheni. All right, now that we finished the sugi of Marar, now we're coming back to matzah. And what we will start learning about our various actions that may speed in the chimutz process, various actions which stops the chimutz process. We're going to be learning how the fear of grains becoming chametz, that will be the first line in the Mishnah, doesn't only apply to the kernel, but even to the bran. After you separated the kernel, there is a chashash chimutz in the bran itself. And therefore starts the Mishnah, Ein shoyden es hamursim l'tanagoyim. That was one of the foods people fed their chickens, their roosters. They would have bran and they would soak it in water and they would feed it to the roosters. Now let it out to their hens. You can't do that. Big machlokes in the Rishonim. Why? Is it because maybe some of the kernel is in there, or some flour is in there? Only flour becomes chametz, not the klipa, but there might be some residue left, or the klipa itself can become chametz. The klipa al pi kabbalah shein chametz, but no, there's the klipa and there's chametz. Be that as it may, you can't. We have to be afraid of being mechametz even only the bran. Avol choltin. Choltin means you are allowed, right, to super cook it or to scald it. As we spoke out in our introduction, that when you apply boiling hot water, and that's the key, boiling, to bran and even to kernels or to flour, it transforms that in such a way that it will never become chametzik. Okay, and therefore that's a solution. L'chayra avol choltin goes on the mursan. That was the food you had. So what are you going to do? They never ate the bran if it wasn't wetted with water. So be chaylet it. You chaylet it and you're good to go. Now, interesting. Soaps. Nowadays, meaning now you go to health stores and many soaps have in them, mamish, you can see the grains. That's a problem of chametz gamur. And by the way, it's roy lachil asadam, many of these expensive soaps. So says the Mishnah, ha'isha loy tishre es hamursan shetoylech biyad l'mercha. It's another usage those days of bran. Again, bran is the klipa that you have after you remove the kernel, is that it was used as soap. But they would soak it in the water and then put it on their bodies. So the same concept, either the bran itself can become chametz, or maybe something of the kernel is in the bran, and that with water will become chametz. So she can't use that when she goes to the bathhouse. But to take dry bran and to smear it on her psara, whether that's a soap or it affects some other perceived or real beauty effect, whatever that is, if there's no water involved, then no problem. Weiter, another din in the Mishnah, lo yilois adam chitin v'yoniach al makasei. One of the medicinal usages of a kernel, now we're speaking about the kernel itself, is that people will chew it, whether it is that saliva, we already learned this together in Chazal, saliva has some sort of medicinal property, whether it is the saliva together with the chitim, and they would put it on a wound, place it shouldn't get infected. So now, when you put liquids, when you put water on chitim, we know that's machamitz. That is how you make chametz. May Peres, whether May Peres or machmitzim, we learned the machloikas, and we're going to learn a lot more about that machloikas. Could be it's machamitz even quicker. Could be b'chlal May Peres ein machmitzim. What about saliva? So the Mishnah is saying that saliva is like water, and therefore you can't chew the chitin and put it on your wound because mepnei shehei machmitzos. Gewaltig. So let's go. Tanach Rabbanan. More when the Mishnah spoke about avocholten. So the Mishnah already introduced.
Rabbi, didn't we learn that May Peres is not machametz? Only if there's water in it, then it could be
we learned it's
faster.
Machloikis, and we'll continue to it's a machloikis. Min hakotze el hakotze. We paskin that May Peres a machmitzim, but we'll see it's a machloikis. Okay. Tanach Rabbanan. Elu devarim she'ein boim l'dei chimutz. Notes again. This is behemshich when the Mishnah said. This was supposed to be practical. They needed to serve Mordechay to the Tanach Goyim. They wouldn't eat bran if it's without liquid. Normally, you would have to soak it. So the eitzah was to be choilet, scalded. Because when you scald bran or even kernels, it no longer will ever become chametz. So the Brisa elaborates that elu devarim she'ein bayim l'dei chimutz. Let's go ha'afui. Anything that's baked. Anything that's baked doesn't only mean after the matzah is baked, the matzah will not become chametz if you soak it in water. It means even if you put grains in the oven, and by the way, that was many people did just that, right? Kali, they would take the moist, just plucked off the ground grains, and they would oven dry it, and then they would make flour. Once you put the kernel in the oven, whether you put the flour, if it was taka properly baked, it will no longer become chametz. Or vahamavushal, something that was properly cooked. Problem is that until the water boils, it's sitting in water. And don't give me the 18 minutes that we never learned in Gemara about the 18 minutes, but we know that it takes 18 minutes. That's only if the waters are room temperature. If the waters are lukewarm or warm before they boil, oy gevalt, they can bring it to chimutz miyad. So we'll get to that in a moment. But if once it was already cooked, then it's not going to become chametz. Likewise, vechalut shecholtei beroischen. If kernels or flour, I don't care what. Once it's scalded, that means boiling hot water was poured on it. Right? What did we learn 2 days ago? We didn't mention it enough. The Toisvis, Hilo Gavar, Tato Gavar, and Daf Lamed Zayin Omid Beis, right? The Meisa and the Chalita, right? And the Gemara says they're both the same. Serusa de Laela, Serusa de Lasata, wherever the fire was coming from, once we're fabrent with the Ruchnias dik of waters, you're never going to become chametz dik again. Okay, end of Brisa. Asks the Gemara, mevushal, how can the Brisa say, v'hamavushal, but ad di mevashalei mechama, like we mentioned. Until it cooks, you put it into a hot water, but the water doesn't begin boiling. The water is still on the fire. By the time it's going to cook, by then it already became chametz. It already, mechama means it fermented. So Eina Chanami. Amar of Papa, Ha'afui Shebishlei Ka'amar. You have to read it different. You have to put the comma in the next word. Once something was already baked, now you can cook it. You're going to cook it, and we said that waters that are not boiling, they are mechametz very quick. Once it's already thoroughly baked, once it's afui, it will never become chametzik, even if you put it in warm waters. Gewaltig. Weiter. Tanya Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Kemach. If you have flour, shenafel otoichet delef. So there's water that's dripping into kemach. Now, you're kidding? You're putting water into flour, right? You're going to leave it sitting. It's going to become chametz. Yeah, that's if you leave it sitting. If it's being worked with, in our case, if it's being pounded by drippings of water, then it will never become chametzik. And by the way, when we read about in the Chumash that we walked with our matzahs, with the dough on our backs, what do you think the sun made it into a baked right away? No, it took a long time. Why didn't it become chametz? Also because since we were walking, it was on our backpacks. When you're moving it, it doesn't become chametzik. Here, you're not moving it, but the water is pounding on it. So, afilu kolayim kulayim, ein boim l'dei chimutz. In other words, the constant pounding of the water, even though it's only a drop, it's a little, it prevents it from becoming chametzik. Another thing that prevents chimutz. Amarav papa, okay, I get that. That's already a little bit dangerous because who the other tifla had the tif. That's only if one drop right after the other. You don't have intervals. However, you measure the intervals. If you have an interval where there's a drop and there's a rega, whatever that rega is, in which there is no drop, yeah, Yaakov. So
I'll ask him a second.
An interval. Then you got yourself a problem. Okay.
With this question, can you hear me?
Yeah.
With the dripping. Are we saying that like mamish is not going to rise, or are we saying that halachically we say that's not called
the latter, Yaakov, not the latter? We're not measuring chimutz with the physical rising. It's something that happens inside of the kernel or inside the flour. Okay. Excuse me. We learned in the yeshiva. Abraisa was taught in the yeshiva of Rab Shila. Vatika. What's mean vatika? Sagt Rashi 4 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Michael Kema, a type of food that's made of flour. Really, it's either flour that was cooked with mashkin, liquids, or water, something with liquids and salt. And they made a vatika dish. So it says over there that vatika can be made on Pesach. It's shari, it's not chametz. We learned in another brayse vatika is asur. So here we go, loy kasha. The brayse that says shari is a vatika, that's flour that was made with oil and salt. Oil and salt. Oil is mashkin. Guys, just to get our verbiage correct. Mashkin always in Chazal refers to the 7 liquids. Right? Yad, shach, dam. That's the remes. The 7 liquids that are mashkin. Mei Peres is any other fruit juice that are not in the category of the 7. Mishcha, just to know, is mashkin because oil is one of the 7 liquids. So it doesn't matter whether it's Mei Peres or whether it's the 7 liquids. He holds that oil and salt are not machametz. The other brayse that says vatika zasur, that is if you have a flour that's made b'mayo milcha. And the point is not just to tell you that b'mayo b'milcha, it's there's a chiddush here again, because once it got fully cooked, then it can no longer become chametz. But that's just to confirm that the brayse we began with that says ha'afui v'hamavushal. No, after afui, cooking doesn't matter. After you achoil it, then I don't care if you cooked it. But when you are cooking something until it becomes boiling hot, it became chametzik even if less than 18 minutes went by. Very good. Amar Marzutra says in Marzutra that loy limchei inish kidra bekimcha da'avi shuna. A person should not thicken a pot of food, as when you have to thicken a pot of food, one of the simplest items, where's tzemach, a chef, we have people, that they throw flour in. It's watery, put in flour. Again, the food is boiling. Now, avishuna is flour that's made from oven-dried grain. So you would think, we just learned, that if you put even grain, I don't care if it's grain or if it's flour or if it's dough, once any grain item on any level was properly baked, it can never become chametzik. So therefore, one would think that if you have flour that was made from oven-dried grain, this avishuna, so they would take grain, when it was righted, they plucked it and they put it into the oven. And I think it sweetened, it kept the sweetness in it, that had a certain effect on the type of flour. So you would think, based on what we learned, you can add that into water, add it into a pot, it can never become chametzik. So that's what Mazutra is saying. Don't do that. Why not? Here we have the chumrah of the gebrach. It's right over here. Dilma, the last line, that loy bashil. Bashil here means baked. Again, the avishuna was baked. It wasn't properly baked. Just because it was in the oven, and we're going to see more details on Daf Mem, we'll go into that into the next year, is that it has to be properly baked. If it's not 100% baked, then v'asi l'dei chimutz, yavaldik. Okay, Amar Rabbi Yosef, another din, we spoke about scalding, and once something is properly scalded, it can never become chametzik. So he says, listen to this. Loy lichlut inesh, a person should not scald Daf Mem, today chita b'hadiyah, two kernels together. Imagine two kernels. If there's only two kernels, you can't scald it, because we need for the boiling hot water to touch every part of the kernel, from ala arba ruchais or from the sheshik savais at one time. And once you're putting them together, now barley is smooth, but wheat has a cleft, because dilme azla chada v'yasva betzidia dechaverta. We'll learn more about barley later. But let's begin with the wheat. He's speaking about chitim, because they have a cleft. Maybe the two kernels, one inserted itself, one sat, pumped in the cleft of the other. And v'lisalik lahu dikula damaya. Dikula means the bubbling water. Yeah, of course, the water got every part of the kernel, but we need it for it to be brenedic when it goes on it. It has to be scalding. And if it was covered, by the time the water got to that cleft, it wasn't scalding. And ma'ar baruchsa. And now you got a problem again. If it wasn't fully scalded, so now it's the worst thing. Hot water that's not boiling not only will bring you to chimutz, but it's going to make it chametzik very quickly. And v'asi l'dei chimutz. And that's here is where the Rosh and the Rif and the other Goinim, they quote other Goinim before them, say that nowadays we are no longer experts in how to scald things. So don't use the scalding. What we feel that we were experts in up until the times of the Alter Rebbe and the Magid was when it comes to baking. So that's why, again, Me'ikar Adin, people said once the matzah is baked, whatever happened, once the dough is baked, you can cook it later. You can cook it later. You can for sure put it in cold water. Hot water is the worst. Lukewarm water is to hot water. If it's not boiling, is the worst. You can do that. But where machmir, Me'ikar Adin, no longer can you do rice, can you do a chalita. That you're not allowed to do based on the Rosh and the Rif. When it comes to the gebrachts, here we're machmir, and we're talking not machmir on the last day of Pesach. But it's all based on the concept that if it wasn't baked, whether the dough wasn't baked, people say it's the dough. It's not just about the dough. It's about maybe there's flour inside the matzah. But people should know that me'ikar adin, even if there's flour that was never mixed with water, once it goes into the oven, theoretically, it can never become chametzik. It's only maybe it was solely stuck in the matzah, so the oven didn't properly bake it. If it wasn't properly baked, then of course it can come l'dei chimut. So we are machmer, and we don't need gebrachts until Achron Shal Pesach. Chevra, a lot more to be continued.
Yeah.
Easy stuff, huh? Let's go back to that. To appreciate this more.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.